Ze var was over, but the remnants of Nazi military nicht still scattered across Europe, silent, rusting, forgotten. Thousands of vehicles, on the symbols of terror, stood abandoned, stripped of tire power and purpose. Some were melted down for resources, others left to decay, while a few found new lives in the hands of foreign powers. As Europe rebuilt, these machines of destruction became burdens, relics of a past no one wanted to remember. Yet, they persisted, fading into the earth, repurposed, or preserved as haunting reminders of our that shaped the future. The war had ended, but the machines of destruction remained. They stood in silent rows, abandoned and forgotten, scattered across Europe. Vehicles once engineered for battle, now left to rot in forgotten fields, rusting under a cold post-war sky. The machines that had been the backbone of the Nazi war effort were no longer needed. The war was over, and their purpose had expired. Amid the rubble of a war-torn continent, the fate of these vehicles became an issue of pragmatic economics. Massive fleets of military trucks, tanks, and armored vehicles had been produced to fuel the Nazi war machine. At the peak of Nazi power, these vehicles filled the factories and supply lines. But now, with the surrender of Germany in May 1945, the need for these tools of war vanished as quickly as the war itself. The scale was staggering. Some estimates suggest that over 40,000 military vehicles had been produced by the Nazis between 1939 and 1945. These included everything from the iconic Panzer tanks to the half-tracks and cargo trucks that crisscrossed Europe. They had been built with a singular purpose: to wage war. And once the war was over, that singular purpose disappeared. What happened to them? Immediately following the war, the Allied forces were faced with the overwhelming problem of what to do with the vast quantities of captured and surplus military equipment left behind. The war had left behind an economic void that demanded immediate attention. The German economy was in ruins, and there was little to no infrastructure to support the production or maintenance of these vehicles. Many of these machines had become obsolete overnight. The New World Order demanded reconstruction, not warfare. These vehicles, once symbols of military might, now stood as relics of a devastating past. The immediate solution was to dismantle and scrap as much as possible. In the years following Germany's surrender, the Allies implemented large-scale scrap drives in both the occupied zones of Germany and the newly established zones of occupation. Tanks and armored vehicles were often sold off or melted down for their metal. Entire fleets were disassembled. At the time, the value of the materials, steel, iron, and aluminum, was crucial for the rebuilding efforts that followed the war. Anything that could be repurposed was. But even after the large-scale dismantling, thousands of vehicles still remained. A large number of these machines were simply abandoned. Some sat in open fields, while others were stored in large depots or factories. The remnants of the once mighty German military were now just a burden. With no one left to use them, they were left to deteriorate. The vehicles, some still functional, were gradually swallowed by time, their engines decaying, their armor rusting. They became the forgotten witnesses to a war that had long since ended. But not all of them would be left to rot. In the early years of the Cold War, some of these abandoned vehicles found new life, albeit in a very different context. The political climate had shifted. The war was over, but new conflicts loomed on the horizon. The Western Allies and the Soviet Union, once co-belligerents, now eyed each other across a rapidly expanding ideological divide. The need for military assets remained, and many of the vehicles, which had been abandoned or left for scrap, were repurposed for the early stages of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, in particular, was eager to take advantage of anything that could aid in rebuilding its own military forces. Some of the German tanks and armored vehicles were transferred to Soviet forces as part of reparations or as spoils of war. These vehicles were often stripped of their Nazi insignia and repainted, their original identity erased. They would go on to serve in Soviet military exercises, or be used to equip satellite states in Eastern Europe. The Germans had built these machines for war, and now the Soviets would use them as tools of their own. On the other side of the divide, the Western Allies took a more calculated approach. Some vehicles, particularly the more technologically advanced models like the Panther and Tiger tanks, were kept as war trophies or studied for their technological innovations. The British, for instance, were particularly interested in the Panther's design, and parts from the vehicle were often used to help develop better armored vehicles for the British Army. The Americans, too, took a keen interest in the engineering behind some of the German vehicles. The knowledge gained from these machines would influence the development of post-war military vehicles, albeit without directly reusing the German machines themselves. In addition to these immediate repurposing efforts, another fate befell a substantial number of the vehicles. They were used for training purposes. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, military academies across Europe, especially in the occupied zones of Germany, would use these vehicles to train new generations of soldiers. Though the war was over, the need for military training persisted. These old vehicles, relics of the past, became the tools for future soldiers. But while some of these vehicles had their second lives, others faced a much more ignoble fate. As Europe slowly rebuilt, many of the old military vehicles continued to be scrapped, their metal sold to pay for the reconstruction of cities and infrastructure. The German economy, still in tatters in the late 1940s, could not support the maintenance of these machines. Many of the vehicles that had once been symbols of power and might were now little more than a drain on limited resources. Factories that had once churned out tanks were now being repurposed to produce civilian goods. The priority was no longer war machines, but the rebuilding of a broken continent. In the 1950s, with the Cold War fully underway, the scrap drives slowed down. Western Europe was beginning to recover, and Germany, too, was on the path to economic recovery. Some of the more iconic vehicles, such as the Panzer IV and the Tiger II, were placed in museums or were used for parades, symbols of a history that was now being carefully remembered. But the vast majority of the vehicles had already been lost, sold for scrap, or destroyed in the chaos of the immediate post-war years. As the years passed, the question of the German military vehicles faded into the background. There were new threats, new technologies, and new wars. The legacy of the war, for many, was one of avoidance, of trying to put the nightmare behind them. The vehicles that had played such an important role in the conflict were no longer a priority. What remained was the memory of their power and the realization that, in the end, they had been as disposable as the men who had fought in them. The fate of these machines was a reflection of the uncertain, unstable world that followed the end of the war. There was no grand ceremony or moment of closure for the vehicles. They were simply discarded, repurposed, or forgotten as the world moved on, desperate to rebuild and forge a new path forward. The story of what happened to them is one of practical necessity, of survival in a world that had no use for them anymore, but of an undeniable loss nonetheless. The aftermath of World War II was a time of intense rebuilding and reorganization. For Europe, the war's end signaled not only the collapse of a totalitarian regime but also the beginning of a new political and economic order. The machines of war, now obsolete and surplus, symbolized the heavy price paid during the conflict, yet their future held an undeniable connection to the world that had emerged from the rubble. As new powers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, began to assert their dominance in Europe, the fates of the once mighty German military vehicles began to unfold further. In the early 1950s, the Western Allies turned their attention to the strategic value of the German military technology that had once been used against them. With the Cold War intensifying, every technological advantage seemed crucial. Some of the surviving vehicles, particularly the more advanced designs like the Tiger and Panther tanks, found a place in military research programs. They were no longer used in combat but instead became the subjects of intense study. The Germans had engineered some of the most formidable tanks of the war, and now, post-war engineers hoped to reverse engineer them to enhance their own armored capabilities. The Americans, who had initially been most concerned with dismantling the German war machine, were now more focused on the innovations that could be adapted for future military use. The U.S. Army took a keen interest in the Panther tank suspension system, for instance. Some reports suggest that parts of the Panther tank, including its tracks and drive system, were studied and used as a basis for improving the design of U.S. Army vehicles. It wasn't just the vehicles themselves that were valuable, but the knowledge contained within them. The German tanks had been built with engineering excellence, and there was much to learn from them. The British, too, found value in the leftover German war machines. The British military analyzed captured tanks and half-tracks, looking to extract useful engineering techniques and incorporating them into their own vehicles. However, unlike the Americans, who were eager to examine and adapt the German designs, the British seemed to focus more on documenting them as examples of what they had faced during the war. These vehicles would, over time, become museum pieces, reminders of the conflict that had scarred Europe. Some, like the famous Tiger tank, were put on display in military museums, symbolizing both the destructive potential of war and the historical reality of Nazi power. Despite the interest from the Allies, the majority of the vehicles remained unwanted, sitting in storage yards, military depots, or abandoned in fields. The logistics of preserving them were too great, and the need for such machinery was simply not there. The European economy was focused on civilian recovery. Factories that had once churned out military vehicles were now being repurposed to produce consumer goods, from automobiles to refrigerators, to meet the urgent needs of a population that had endured years of destruction. With the continent still reeling from the consequences of war, the maintenance of tanks and armored vehicles seemed a distant concern. The Soviet Union, like the Western Allies, had its own designs on the captured German war machines. The USSR had been the largest recipient of German military equipment after the war, and it eagerly transported vast quantities of tanks, trucks, and other vehicles back to Soviet territory. The Soviets were not just interested in using these vehicles for their own immediate military needs, however, they were more interested in how they could utilize these machines to bolster their industrial capacity. The vehicles were stripped down, reverse-engineered, and analyzed. Parts were taken to Soviet factories, where they would form the foundation for future Soviet designs. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, some of the tanks and trucks were put to use in Soviet military exercises, serving as training vehicles for new recruits. These older German vehicles, even though outdated, provided a necessary resource during the early years of the Cold War when Soviet military resources were still being rebuilt. However, the longer these vehicles stayed in service, the more obsolete they became. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union had shifted its focus to its own designs, leaving many of the German vehicles behind. In addition to the repurposing of these vehicles for military use, there were some efforts to sell or distribute the remaining machines to other countries. Some were sold off to nations that had been devastated by the war, while others were distributed to new communist states in Eastern Europe as part of Soviet influence. These vehicles, although often stripped of their original markings and repainted, served as symbols of the new order in Eastern Europe. The German technology, once a symbol of Nazi power, was now part of the Soviet bloc's military arsenal. While many of the vehicles continued to serve in various capacities, some were simply abandoned and left to deteriorate. The large number of vehicles that had been left in depots or scattered across Europe were beyond salvage. The practicalities of wartime repair were impossible to implement in the years following the war's end. A significant portion of the abandoned tanks, half-tracks, and trucks were left in rural areas or military storage yards, where they slowly rusted away. It is estimated that hundreds of vehicles were left to decay in open fields, often disappearing into the earth as time passed, with only their remnants to remind the world of the brutality they had once carried out. One of the more tragic outcomes for many of these abandoned vehicles was that they were scrapped beyond recognition. As Europe entered the 1950s, the desire for scrap metal became a driving force in the economy. The remnants of war were gathered up, melted down, and repurposed for rebuilding purposes. Tank bodies were melted into new steel for civilian infrastructure, and the metal was given new life as part of the rebuilding effort. What was once a massive tank, a symbol of warfare, became little more than a piece of industrial material. However, not all the vehicles were completely lost. Some did survive into the 1960s and beyond. A handful of tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles managed to remain intact, preserved in military museums or private collections. The Tiger tank, for instance, remains an iconic symbol of Nazi military might and is often seen as the last remaining testament to the power that once stood behind it. The few surviving vehicles, housed in museums, are carefully maintained, and they stand today as a historical reminder of the war that shaped the world. Yet, even these few surviving machines carry a weight of history. The fact that they were preserved at all speaks not only to their technical and historical significance but also to the profound sense of loss and trauma that surrounded them. For many, these vehicles were not just machines of war, they were symbols of a destructive ideology that had led to the deaths of millions. Their preservation, while important from a historical perspective, is not without a sense of discomfort, as they embody the darker elements of the past. As the decades passed and the Cold War deepened, the need for these old machines diminished further. By the 1960s, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact had moved on to more modern tanks and armored vehicles. The iconic German designs, once seen as cutting-edge, were now obsolete. Their time had passed, and the world had moved on to new forms of warfare. These vehicles, abandoned, scrapped, or repurposed, were left to be forgotten in the pages of history.